Hello and welcome to another video from the English at Penrice YouTube channel. Today we are going to be having a look at how to plan effectively for an Inspector Calls character exam question. This will help support your revision for your English Literature Paper 2, Section A. The first thing that we are going to do before we start approaching our exam question plan is to have a look at the mark scheme. So we're going to make sure that when we plan for our response, we are fulfilling the criteria that the examiner will be using when they assess our work. And in order to make sure that our answer covers all of these criteria, our plan will also include lots of relevant ideas that meet all of the AOs. First of all, we have AO1, so a critical exploratory response to the task and text, and also judicious use of precise references. So that means that your answer and your plan should be underpinned by key concepts that the writer wants to convey, or big ideas. So those could be things surrounding ideas like class or gender, in the case of Inspector Calls. You'll also select the best quotes and references. So by references, we can point to the text. We don't have to use a quote all the time in order to meet that AO1 criteria. Although knowing the text as confidently as you should do will allow you to choose both quotes and references that really help you to respond to the task that you've been set and to help you expand on your concept that you planned for and outlined in your introduction. And then moving on to AO2. Now this is the writer's methods AO. So for this AO, we'll be looking at how to analyse the methods critically, so both language and structural methods, and support your analysis with subject terms. And we'll look at how you can start to do that even in your plan. And then finally, AO3. So the AO3 is ideas, perspectives, and context. You should be able to develop your analysis by exploring the ideas that the writer wants to convey to their audience or their reader, their intention, so why they are constructing the character in a certain way, why they present this idea to the audience, and their message behind that. We can plan for this as well. And of course, AO3 links to relevant social context. So anything that links your quotes or your references in a relevant way to the task and the wider social context. So on to planning for a response then. So let's have a look at this first question. How far does Priestley present Mr. Burling as an unlikable character? And a question like this on your paper 2 section A will be worth 30 marks. So let's have a quick look at the question itself, decide what our focus is, and then we'll start to think about how to plan. So first of all, we've got that phrase, how far. So this is a really nice exam starter, question starter, because we can argue for and against. Now we're focusing on the character of Mr. Burling and how he is conveyed as unlikable. So we don't warm to him as an audience. Now, in terms of Mr. Burling, we might well argue that he is unlikable, and the how far won't come into play too much, in that we perhaps won't be able to argue too much that he is likeable. In terms of our plan then, we should always try to start with a plan for our overall concept that will underpin the rest of our response. And this is going to form our introduction. So in terms of this question, we might plan for the concept that Mr. Burling is a symbol of Edwardian upper middle class selfishness and thoughtlessness. And Priestley was criticising this selfish way of being. So that's our concept, just briefly planned out, ready to be turned into our introduction. And then we might move on and plan for each extended paragraph. So I'm talking about our paragraphs being around 3/4 of a page to a page long. So linking to my concept, my first paragraph is going to outline how Mr. Burling is a capitalist, and capitalist selfishness perpetuates, so maintains, carries on working class struggle and inequality. So his selfishness and thoughtlessness and his inability to appreciate the struggles of the working class continues that situation for them, and it doesn't allow them to break out of it. Thus, we think he's unlikable because he doesn't appreciate what the poorer people in society need. A good reference to use, a good quote to use to respond to that, to support that, is "I refused, of course." So obviously that's linking to his response to Eva Smith's request for a pay rise. And we can talk about the method, there being a very dismissive tone. We talk about the phrase, "of course," as if he's unable to compromise at all. We're also planning to link that to context. So in the Edwardian era, there were no trade unions, so there was no support for workers beyond the workplace. So Eva Smith or the employees like her would have been unable to reach out for help and support. Another reference, another quote that links to that first one is, "She had far too much to say, so she had to go." I might talk about the irony that Priestley uses there as a method, considering Mr. Burling is very, very verbose, has a huge amount to say, and we know that he's the first person to speak in the play, and he talks using some really lengthy speeches during that opening engagement party. This idea of having far too much to say makes him quite unlikable because he's obviously looking down upon an opinionated employee. But it also might link to the idea that he is criticising maybe a female who has ideas and opinions to share. Broadening out then, we might think that his reference to socialism, calling community care and collective responsibility nonsense, and his use of the beehive simile. It shows that he's really self-interested, he's not able to look beyond himself and his own family's needs, and that makes him very unlikable. This links to his obsession with his reputation and his status, and we have references to the public scandal that he's anxious about and his repeated reference to his knighthood. And again, that links to his selfishness as an affluent capitalist and his self-interested state of mind. All of this juxtaposes with the Inspector Gould, who is obviously Priestley's mouthpiece. And Mr. Burling, in a very derogatory way, refers to Inspector Gould and other socialist thinkers as cranks. And so he comes across again as unlikable through that rudeness and that inability to see the world from a socialist perspective. Then we're moving on, and in our second paragraph, we're going to talk about how unlikable he is because of his stubborn indifference to Eva's struggle and hardship, even after he's told about her horrifying death, and even after all of his family have been interrogated. The quote he perhaps is best to use it towards the end of the play there is, "Your mother and I had every excuse for what we did." So he's blatantly being very ignorant there. He's not accepting his responsibility, and he remains unchanged. And he's unlikable because he doesn't accept blame for such an awful situation that he has contributed to. He is part of that chain of events that the inspector refers to, yet he is unable to feel remorse for that, and thus he's unlikable. I can link that idea perhaps to the circular narrative and Ouspensky's theory of time, and in that Mr. Burling is failing to learn moral lessons and therefore will perhaps continue in this cycle of the inspector arriving and the interrogations until he is able to appreciate his part to play and his the requirement for him to show some collective responsibility. Linked to this then as well is the stage direction that Priestley uses that makes Mr. Burling seem even more unlikable at the end of the play, which is triumphantly. So he speaks in a really celebratory way, as if he's won a victory over the inspector. Now, to do that when the audience and the family on stage have been presented with a horrifying account of a girl's suicide, seems incredibly disgusting. And the audience quite clearly will see Mr. Burling as very unlikable and very off-putting at that point. And then in my final paragraph, my extended paragraph, remember, so this might take me on to my third page of my response, I might talk about how his thoughtlessness even extends to his family. So beyond Eva Smith, he still appears to be very unlikable. His response to his children at the end of the play, saying they can't take a joke, and the stage direction amused when he's talking to them, shows that he's really mocking them. He's mocking their change. He's mocking their appreciation of that socialist outlook that the inspector has tried to convey to them successfully. This results in the audience being quite repelled by him, that in such a situation he can be so patronising and mocking towards his own family and his children, who have really appreciated the terrible nature of the situation and the need for change as a result. It's also really patronising at this point, so use the imperatives, go to bed and don't look like that when he's talking to Sheila. And this really just causes the audience to dislike him even more, because as an audience we're probably encouraged to appreciate that the younger generation have changed and there is hope for the future, where people like Mr. Burling and his thoughtless actions will have less of an impact upon people like Eva Smith. Unfortunately, Mr. Burling is unable to appreciate that too. And then finally, that links to Eric's description of him as not the kind of father a chap could go to when he's in trouble. And that really underlines how Mr. Burling, in a very unlikable way, has a serious lack of empathy and is truly ignorant, not only to the working class, but indeed to his own family. Right, let's have a look at another plan. So this time the question is, how does Priestley use Eva Smith to criticise inequality in Edwardian society? So the character focus, obviously, we have is Eva Smith, so we are focusing on her throughout our response. But in terms of more narrow focus, we're going to look at how the writer is using that character as a construct to criticise the different treatment, the different opportunities between people in Edwardian society, so the era in which the play was set. Okay, so remembering all of the elements of the mark scheme, trying to get these into our plan as much as we can. First off, I'm going to start with my clear concept. So this will form my introduction when I write out in full. So my concept here is going to outline that Eva Smith is a symbol of the working class female struggle. So I'm going to make it clear that not only is there class inequality in Edwardian society, and that's conveyed through this character, but there's also gender inequality in Edwardian society. And that leads obviously to struggle, hardship and mistreatment. And again, Priestley is criticising this. He's desirous of a change in society, of social reform, where there is more equality through socialism. Okay, so my first paragraph, I'm going to centre on the struggle that is the consequence of this inequality. Eva Smith is described in this list of adjectives as lonely, half-starved and desperate. So this is what the inspector is telling us about Eva Smith, and that is the result of Edwardian inequality. He also uses that word desperate a second time when he describes Eva Smith later on in the play. And that repetition we might bring in as a method really emphasises her despair as a working class female who was treated very differently to more affluent members of society at the time. This is a consequence of capitalist mistreatment. So the taking advantage of the power that capitalists, the affluent capitalists such as factory owners like Mr. Burling, leads to the inequality between the classes and the powerlessness of the working class. We can bring in that reference to Mr. Burling's response to Eva's request for a pay rise here again. So we can use that quote, "I refused bringing in that method of the dismissive tone. But we can also highlight how it's ironic that Mr. Burling is pointed out by his own son as trying for the highest prices, while Eva is not able to request a pay rise and be considered to have have the right to do that at all. I'm going to link that to context because obviously again we can say there were no trade unions to support workers, to support the working class. So when they requested a pay rise, there was no one else to appeal to, and as a result obviously the strike action occurred and Eva was fired. Again, we have this idea of inequality though through Mr. Burling's utterance that she had far too much to say, which again is ironic and also maybe links to gender inequality, with women being disenfranchised in the Edwardian era, so not having the vote, but also being very powerless and lacking a voice and an ability to share their opinions and their views in general. Then moving on to how Priestley is criticising the effect of inequality through Eva's poverty. She's described as counting her pennies in her dingy back bedroom. That image is very sort of melancholy, and we really as an audience appreciate her struggle. Again, though, we have this juxtaposed with the Burlings drinking port and champagne, and there's a really strong sense of the divide between the classes and the inequality between the working class and the more affluent upper middle and upper classes. Really highlights how that inequality links to hardship on Eva's part and, of course, the wider working class. This struggle, this hardship leads her to desperate actions. So she turns to another kind of life, as the inspector puts it, which is a euphemism for prostitution. And that's where we know Gerald meets her at the Palace Bar. She also desperately turns to Mrs. Burling's charity, but unfortunately is turned away and the door is slammed in her face. Again, linking to social context, there was no welfare state during the Edwardian era, so that Mrs. Burling's charity seemed to be the only way out for Eva, as prostitution did at one point in her life. We can also talk about how Eva is used as a symbol for inequality in Edwardian society at this point, by talking about how this hardship affected millions and millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths. And that's uttered by the inspector in his rhetorical speech at the end of the play. And then finally, the last thing I want to plan for in my response, so maybe this might be towards my third page perhaps, is how this inequality in Edwardian society results in horrifying consequences, specifically for Eva, her terrible, gruesome death and her suicide. And we as an audience fully appreciate that because the inspector uses really gruesome, gory imagery, telling the Burling family immediately that she burnt her insides out when she drank bleach, but also through his use of juxtaposition when he says that she had a promising life, but a nasty mess somebody made of it. And that highlights this terrible consequence of this inequality, that she had no chance to live a full and rewarding life before it was ended prematurely. I might even, if I have time, bring in the idea of Sheila and how she might have many opportunities that a working class female like Eva Smith would not. Okay, so today we've been having a look at how to plan thoughtfully for an extended character response for your An Inspector Calls exam question. Do sign up to the English at Penrice YouTube channel for more videos to support your English literature and language revision.